All right, Chapter 10, photosynthesis, is going to go through just basically how the plants use carbon dioxide and form sugar, and then how they give off oxygen as a byproduct. And so in 1779, things were obviously a little different, but what they thought was that sunshine splits apart the carbon dioxide, and that the plant has absorbed from the air, and the plant throws out at that time the oxygen alone and keeps the carbon for itself as nourishment. Now, that's not what happens. Okay, so we're going to go through what actually happens. The carbon is used to make carbohydrates, and the oxygen actually comes from the splitting of water. Okay, so the main idea here is that photosynthesis uses the energy from sunlight to produce the chemical energy needed for life. That would be sugar molecules, and that light is converted into chemical energy. Okay, so in other words, the energy of light is converted into different forms of energy, ATP, and then the stored energy of carbohydrate. Okay, so from a TOK standpoint, to what extent is the creation of an elegant protocol similar to the creation of a work of art? All right, so take a second and write down the answer to that, and then we'll be sure to talk about it in class. Okay. So, hopefully by now you know the difference between an autotroph and a heterotroph. Autotroph is something that can make its own food using sunlight as an energy source, and an inorganic carbon compound, in this case CO2. And then heterotrophs, these are organisms that are unable to make their own food, and they have to rely on the autotrophs in order to do that. And generally speaking, the plants are autotrophic and the animals are heterotrophic. Okay, so as far as chloroplasts go, these are the main sites of photosynthesis in plants, and all green parts of plants have them. And the greener the part, typically the more chloroplasts that they have. And chlorophyll is that pigment found within the chloroplasts. There's a couple different types, but the main type here is chlorophyll A, and that's the main photosynthetic pigment that's involved in absorbing sunlight so that the plants can carry out the process of photosynthesis. Now, if you look at this leaf, the chloroplasts largely are found in the mesophyll, and the mesophyll is generally from here down to here, and then this part right up here, okay, this would be the palisade mesophyll, and that's the kind of the tall columnar things, and then down here, this portion here, this is the spongy, okay? So this is the site of gas exchange. So a lot of the sunlight energy is absorbed up here, okay, and then a lot of the gas exchange and the other portions of photosynthesis that we're going to talk about occur down in here. So this is like the cross section of a leaf, and this, of course, up here, this would be the top part of the leaf. So this is where the sunlight energy would be coming in. Okay. All right, so chloroplasts have a site of gas exchange, like I told you here on the bottom, in the spongy mesophyll. And they have these little tiny openings on the bottom called stomata. And these are the things that allow the CO2 in and the oxygen gas that's made out. They go through these tiny pores here. And the leaves contain these things. And this is where, in the leaf, of course, where photosynthesis takes place, of course, you need that gas exchange. And that's where the sugar is then going to get transported to. If you look in here, in this kind of region right here, you can see kind of the vascular portion of the plant. I don't know if that shows up very well in that color, so I can make it a different color here. Shows up in this portion right here. This is the vascular portion of the plant. So the xylem and phloem. The xylem is going to bring the water up to help assist with gas exchange, and then the phloem is going to take the sugars that are created down to the roots of the plants and stored in the sinks and that sort of a thing. Okay, so chloroplasts and mitochondria are very similar. They're both enclosed by two membranes, and then within the chloroplast is the stroma. That's kind of the liquidy interior of the chloroplast, and this is where the light-independent reactions take place. So occasionally they're referred to as the dark reactions, but we want to refer to them and know them as the light-independent reactions. And then within the stroma, within that liquidy interior of the chloroplast, we have these tiny kind of interconnected stacks called grana. And an individual stack here, like you see right here, this would be called a granum. That's kind of singular, and then all of them collectively would be grana. And these are the sites where the actual light reactions or the light-dependent reactions takes place. So this is where the light is going to be absorbed. Of course, they're green here. You can see they have chloroplasts in them as well. So the light is going to get absorbed here, and then we'll talk more about these light-dependent reactions here coming up. Okay, so now in general, photosynthesis kind of occurs according to the following equation. So we have some carbon dioxide here, and then we have some water, and then we have this light energy. So this is what's coming from, generally, we could say, the sun. And then we're going to form some carbohydrate. That's this glucose in this instance. Oxygen is a byproduct, and water is also a byproduct. And if you recall back to cellular respiration, it's essentially the reverse of that. So we're going to take the carbohydrates that we've made from these autotrophs, and we're going to burn that in the presence of oxygen. We're going to give off CO2 and water, and then we're going to get energy, in our case, the ATP energy. That's what cellular respiration is going to generate. So these two processes are basically the reverse of one another, just depending on what the energy is that we're talking about here. Okay, so as far as the atoms are concerned, the atoms that are involved, these are the ones, this is where really the oxygen is coming from. And initially, this was back in 1779 with Ingenhousz. This is where they thought the CO2 got split, and that's where the oxygen came from. But this does not occur. That's not what actually happens, okay? And they also thought then once that was split, that this carbon combined with the water to give the carbohydrate. For instance, this general formula could be C6H12O6 if you multiplied the whole thing by 6. But again, that is not what happens, okay? So that was just like with anything in science. You start with a hypothesis, you start testing it, and as the scientific advances kind of take place, give you better technology, etc., you have ways to test these things. So this wasn't actually what happened, but for the time it was a decent hypothesis. And in the 1930s now, as people continued to kind of work with this and experiment with it, there was a lot of things that were happening. But C.B. Van Niel was a scientist at Stanford University, and he was working with photosynthetic bacteria. And he showed that, in fact, it wasn't CO2 that was split, it was something else. Because one of the bacteria that he was working with, I should say, used hydrogen sulfide as its hydrogen source. And he noticed that the waste product that was being produced were these yellow globules of sulfur. So in other words, when this was getting split, the hydrogens were being used as the hydrogen source for reducing things, and then sulfur became the waste product. And then he started to kind of draw some comparisons to the way the water was actually behaving. Okay, his reasoning is that the bacteria using these hydrogen atoms from the hydrogen sulfide to make the sugar, and he generalized it to say no matter what the hydrogen source was, that was what was going to get split, and the waste product given off was that which was attached to the hydrogen. And that hydrogen source was then used to make sugar, and that byproduct was either sulfur or oxygen, for instance. So here's what we mean. Here's the carbon dioxide that's being used by the bacteria or the plants or in general, whatever you're looking at. And here's our hydrogen source. Okay, so here it's H2S, and we can see that sulfur is given off as a waste product as this gets split. Here it's H2O, and as the hydrogens are being used to make the sugar, oxygen is being given off as the waste product. So his generalization is anything that's attached to the hydrogen, our hydrogen source, when this gets split, whatever it is that's attached to the hydrogen is given off as the waste product there. Okay, so that was kind of his hypothesis there. And as scientists began to learn more about the effective use of radioactive tracers, they discovered radioactive oxygen. And what they were able to do is confirm what Van Niel had said. So what they did was they made some water. Okay, in the lab you can do these sorts of things. And what they did was they made some heavy water. So in other words, they made H2O that contained oxygen 18 with the water molecule. So the H2O contained this radioactive atom of isotope of oxygen. Okay, and then they also formulated some CO2 that contained the radioactive oxygen as well. And what they were able to show is that when the O18 was used in the water, the oxygen gas that was given off contained the radioactive oxygen. And if the carbon dioxide contained the radioactive oxygen, then the plant contained carbohydrates and water that contain the radioactive oxygen. So if we look here, you can see here's our experiment with the radio-labeled water. So here's the radioactive oxygen in the water. When this water gets split, this oxygen combines to give radioactive oxygen gas that's being given off. And when the carbon dioxide is used, we're not splitting the carbon dioxide, of course, we're splitting the water. So our oxygen gas is normal. Okay, so here's where the oxygen goes. But because this carbon dioxide source contained the radioactive oxygen, some of these oxygen atoms go into the carbohydrate, the glucose, for instance, and some of it goes into the water. Okay, so here's kind of a fate map, as they're called, of these particular atoms. So the red ones found in CO2, these atoms end up here, here, in here. And then with the water being in blue, these atoms end up here, here, and here. And of course, it's the splitting of water that gives us this oxygen gas. Okay? And that's referred to as the photolysis of water. So you're going to want to remember that. Like, in other words, the waste product of photosynthesis is oxygen gas. Where does this oxygen gas come from? And you would say the splitting of water or the photolysis of water. Okay? All right, so now as far as photosynthesis and cell respiration, we said that these things were essentially the reverse of one another. So what happens is during respiration, the electrons get released from the glucose, and these things fall down towards the oxygen and give us our water vapor that we're giving off. And then when we're burning the glucose, we exhale the CO2 as well. And then this energy is harnessed as these electrons fall, and it's used to create or form the ATP from the ADP in the cytoplasm, okay, or in the mitochondria, and it gets into the cytoplasm and it gets burned up. So recall the matrix of the mitochondria is where this ATP is getting made. In photosynthesis now, we're basically reversing this electron flow. So in other words, what we're doing is as the water gets split and gives us some hydrogen atoms, these things, along with the electrons, get transferred to carbon dioxide to give us sugar. So we're going from a fully oxidized form of carbon, and then we start adding these hydrogen atoms, okay, hydrogen ions, and the electrons to get the reduced form of carbon, which would be right here. And the process here requires sunlight energy, okay, so we need energy in the form of sunlight to drive the synthesis of ATP. Okay, and then that ATP and the reducing power, as you'll see shortly, is what's responsible for generating this. Okay, so in the chloroplast, here's what happens. We've got our water coming in. This water gets split. Oxygen gas is given off as a byproduct. The light reactions, as you'll see shortly, generate some ATP and some NADPH. This is reducing power, okay, and this ATP is our energy that we're going to use to run the Kelvin cycle. And what that's going to do is that's going to convert CO2 into sugar, and here's our hydrogens and the electrons, which are coming from these electron carriers of the NADPH. Okay, so that takes care of Chapter 10, Part 1, and we'll see you soon for Part 2.